that money.
Absolutely. Thanks. Thanks. It's wonderful to be here with you tonight. Thanks very much for Innovation Coast sponsoring and for the hosting at this wonderful facility. It's just gorgeous here, and I know Peter's got a good thing going. So, as Bob said, I'm Rick Harper. I'm an economist, recovering academician, retired from the university in December of 2017 in order to take this gig with Triumph Gulf Coast. After having been an economist, for these many years, actually since 1979, if I were counting, that's a long time, I really didn't want, actually selfishly, I didn't want anybody else to do this work of scoring proposals, evaluating what's good, what could work best for Northwest Florida. And so after having spent really a career looking at the economy of Northwest Florida, how the labor markets work, what our most important sectors are, what the forecasts are for things that could grow, what could be our key occupations going forward, it's something that I just have a huge amount of interest in doing. And so when it became possible to do that, I really was eager to take the opportunity. I explored doing it through the university, but of course, you know, given that the university is applying for funds under this program, strangely enough, the general counsel at the university said, Rick, I just don't see how you could possibly be an employee of the university and then opine on all the proposals that are going forward, you know, saying something like, well, that's a good proposal, but not as good as the UWF proposal. Another good one, but not as good as UWF. So anyway, I had to retire to do it, but happy to be there. And so currently we have, there's two stages. It's a process, as you might imagine. And the first step is very straightforward. It's a pre-application. It's 3 pages of questions. We don't ask you about any of your economic impact information in that pre-application. We're not trying to figure out how economically valuable your project is going to be. Instead, we're trying to figure out whether the project that you describe fits in one of the eligible funding buckets that Triumph has available. Back when the legislation was first written in the aftermath of the oil spill, it was fairly permissive in terms of the sorts of activities that could be funded using the dollars that came to Triumph. And of course, this is funded. You may recall that in April 2015, federal judge Ken Barbier in New Orleans signed off at U.S. Attorney General Holder's strong suggestion on a $19.2 billion global settlement between BP North America and all of the public entities that were currently suing BP, okay, for damages. And so the state of Florida, I had the privilege of serving as the state of Florida's expert economist during that litigation, sponsored by General Bondi, of course, that went forward. And it resulted in a $2 billion settlement for economic damages. And so it's important to realize that there's a number of pots associated with the Deepwater Horizon disaster. There's the Restore funding, there's the NIFWIF funding, there's all sorts of funding, but our funding that's administered by Triumph Gulf Coast is the funding that was generated by economic losses to the state of Florida. And as you might imagine, given that we had relatively little oil reach our shores, I mean, if you went to Pensacola Beach, you saw plenty of oil at certain times, but it didn't extend all that far eastward. But the major damage that we had was from things like, you know, if you're a bride-to-be, you can't plan a July wedding at Sandestin if you don't know if the whole place is going to be covered in oil over there. And so you can't rent a condo at Gulf Shores or even as far east as Panama City Beach or even beyond if you don't know what the scenario is going to be. And so lots of the damages that we were working to prove up and present to the litigation team had to do with lost damages due to people changing their visitation behavior. Really, BP was fairly generous in the sorts of activities that they took to be tourism related. Wedding photographers were out of a job. Anybody associated with the seafood industry had damages. And so all of those things, given that we here in Florida, and particularly our visitors, pay sales tax and bed tax and other sorts of taxes on everything that they buy when they're in state. And that's, been a strategy, conscious strategy for a long time. We can avoid paying taxes ourselves as Floridians if we can just tax our visitors for what they do while they're here. And so that meant a lot of lost revenue. And while the other states, nobody got more than $1 billion, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Florida got $2 billion for economic damages, even though we didn't have as much oil on the beach, but it was all due to changes in consumer behavior. Now, the Florida legislature passed legislation. This was when, there's a multi-year procession of speakers of the House and speaker designates and presidents of the Senate and president designate. And so, of course, our own Don Gates was in that chain, and he saw to it that we got the Triumph legislation, which allocated 75% of any economic damages funding to come to the counties of Northwest Florida. And there was some back and forth about which counties should be included, but really to get a political consensus that went all the way over to Tallahassee, essentially, Wakulla County, Crawfordville. And so those 8 counties then, that 200 miles, will need to, over a period of time, spend that damages money. And so we had started with a 5-person board, went to a 7-person board to get more representation for the rural counties. Stan Connolly has left in anticipation of his move to Atlanta. He's left the board, so now we have a 6-person board, which means that, all you need really is 3 votes to get a winning project. We don't know yet when the replacement appointee will be made. We certainly hope that it's somebody from west of Okaloosa County, because with Stan's departure, there is nobody from west of Okaloosa County on the board. The Eastern delegation, Representative Beshears, representing Tallahassee and the rural areas, got a provision, an amendment stuck into the Triumph legislation saying that at least 5% of the first tranche of funding had to go to each county. So when you add up the 8 counties, that's 40% of your funding allocated to specific counties. And then of subsequent tranches, 4% goes to each county. That adds up to $63 million across the $1.5 billion over time. And BP did what any defendant would do. They argued to the judge, well, this is going to break us. We can't pay $19.2 billion in 1 year. Clearly, that's insane. And so Judge Barbier granted their motion to pay $1 billion, to split the payment into 15 payments over 18 years for the state of Florida. So we've had our first payment of $400 million, which means Triumph has 300 of that 400, 75%, to work with. It's currently encumbered, at least on a tentative basis. The first check just went out the door last week to Wakulla County School District, but they've encumbered about $80 million of that first $300 million of funding. The biggest single project that's gotten tentative approval for funding is the Pensacola Airport Maintenance Repair Overhaul Facility, where the directors approved a tentative allocation of $56 million for a commitment, a firm job commitment of 1,325 high-wage jobs to be phased in over a spool-up period as those hangars get built to house that activity, then with a maintenance period of 7 years for each of those jobs. And so the estimated increment to household incomes in Northwest Florida from that project is on the order of $500 million over time, which is over a 10-year window, which is a huge increment to the well-being of households. And that's what the Triumph directors are all about. So the message, the number one takeaway that I want to leave you with this evening is that if you are aware of a project that has the potential to better the economic lives of Northwest Floridians, bring it forward. And that's the number one criterion that the Triumph Board has insisted on. It's the economic damages money. We're not trying to replace the restore spending. We're not trying to replace other environmental spending that could be done. In fact, if you come forward with an environmental improvement project that doesn't have as its centerpiece job creation and household income creation, then you're not going to get past the pre-application stage. The staff will write you back and say, it appears that the project, as you have conceived it, does not fit the allowable funding buckets for Triumph Gulf Coast. And what we have arrived at is really two basic sorts of major funding buckets. There's a couple of other allowable sources, such as if you want to do marketing for Northwest Florida, Triumph can provide match to Visit Florida expenditures. If you want to market fresh from Florida, or Santa Rosa Fresh, we can provide matching funding to do that. If you are looking at implementing a county disaster plan that was in existence before the Triumph legislation, we can help you do that. But we're not getting many proposals in those realms. Instead, we're getting the most proposals in two buckets. One bucket is for career and technical education, so professional training, and a lot of people in this room are heavily involved in career and technical education. And the metric, as you might imagine, given the long and storied history of Okaloosa County, you know, the choice institutes across Florida, well, I can tell you that back in the day, choice used to stand for Career High, Okaloosa Institutes for Career Education, acronym CHOICE. But when it moved up to be a state level program, they had to come up with different words to form that acronym, because it still was choice, but it became statewide, and Florida is now a leader in industry recognized certifications for career and technical education. And the people in this room, by and large, the ones of you that I know, are heavily involved in fields where there is an emphasis, a growing emphasis on certifications for the workers that you work with, and perhaps a decreasing emphasis on the traditional kind of degree programs that we've always seen as good signaling devices out there in the market. This person has a BA from here, that person has a master's from there, this person has a PhD from here. Instead, I think for many of you, you look at the types of skill sets as represented by passage of externally validated, industry recognized certificate programs. And so we fund those left and right. And those can either come through school districts or they can come through private entities. Okay? So that's a number one bucket. And then a second bucket is for public infrastructure for job creation. That's the basis of building hangars at the Pensacola Airport. They're publicly owned. However, they're going to be filled by maintenance, repair, overhaul activities. And, you know, that's a business where you're basically selling skilled labor at an hourly rate to airlines, and you've seen the UPS trucks parked up there at the airport right now, and so it works because it grows jobs, grows family incomes, but it's publicly owned infrastructure. And frankly, this is a result of having had Richard Corcoran as Speaker of the House. He is, I think it's, you know, fair to say that he's a Koch brothers Republican, no more corporate welfare. Florida is not going to pick winners and losers. And therefore, the legislation comes with a specific caveat that the skills in the education program have to be applicable to more than one employer, and that the public infrastructure has to be to a public entity that takes ownership rather than, we can't provide infrastructure to private companies. I mean, you might remember the $30 million fund that UWF administered. There it was kind of the opposite, that we were giving money to private companies, none to public entities. Well, they've flipped it on us now so that, and we understand that Speaker-designate Oliva, who becomes Speaker in November, has at least as strong views about what to do with money. So infrastructure dollars go to public entities, which is why the way to get to that money is to figure out your appropriate partnership with a public entity and make that work. Make it work for the public entity and for you. So the airport MRO facilities intend to lease out and have those employees there over a long period of time, but that's okay. You know, the airport owns the hangars. So that's the basics of what our programs look like. And so the process, you submit a pre-application, staff comes back and says, we see this as being a potentially eligible use or not. And to save people the time and effort of filling out I mean, we've actually recently seen proposals that were 421 pages long, not to mention any names. But of course, a lot of that is financials for responsible entities, and so you know, if you've got city or county government, their financials are going to be that long. So we will receive our second tranche of funding, which if you know, the first $400 million came, which leaves BP with $1.6 billion to pay, and they've got 14 more payments starting annually July 1st, 2019, and then that means that they're paying about $110 million a year, and of that, about 80 is going to come to Triumph Gulf Coast. We were successful in the most recent legislative session. The Broxson Amendment, thank you, Senator Broxson, got an amendment which says that as soon as the Attorney General of Florida receives the check from BP and puts it in the bank into the AG account before it then gets swept into the legislative appropriations process, the AG will send a check for 3/4 of that amount to Triumph Gulf Coast. So it bypasses the legislative appropriations process, which, I mean, can you imagine that some people would want to fund cleaning up Lake Okeechobee and the Indian River Lagoon and algae blooms? And so I could see that the Triumph money could easily go the way of the Sadowski Affordable Housing Trust, the Lawton Childs Tobacco Education Endowment, and numerous other trust funds that were created and earmarked to go to certain purposes. So hopefully we have at least somewhat preempted that process. It will take an affirmative act by the legislature to go in, open up that statute, and change the legislation to say that, oh no, wait a minute, that Triumph Gulf Coast money is actually going to go to you know, sinkholes in Central Florida or something of that effect. So we hope that we're somewhat insulated, but of course, there's always a risk. And so, with that being said, what I would propose to do is questions and answers. I'd be happy to discuss any and all topics, Triumph related or otherwise. You can certainly ask me what the Fed's going to do. I'm an economist after all. So, yes, Bill.
Rick, could you, and thank you for being here.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Can you describe the customer experience? Can you describe the applicant's experience once the application is made? How painful is it? How frictionless is it?
Right. It's intended to be a collaborative process. The view of the Triumph directors and everyone on the Triumph staff, small staff that it is, there's Corey Henderson, you might know from Enterprise Florida, me, there's Dr. Frank Fuller, who handles our career technical education projects. There's Susan Skelton, the executive director, and then on an hourly basis, we've retained Scott Remington at Clark Partington to be our general counsel, but you'll never get to talk to him because he charges by the hour. So, with the small staff that we have, we figure that we all have the same mission, that everybody in this room is looking to improve the economic environment and create a business opportunity that pays more wages to your employees and creates more economic opportunity. So this is not like an application to, you know, the DARPA or to National Science Foundation or to NIH, where it's, you know, double-blind review process and you are entirely unknown. We know who you are, and the objectives of the staff are to provide you with the opportunity to put your best foot forward. So it's intended to be collaborative. I think that may be difficult because lots of people don't understand how this could be. They don't actually know the basics of economic impact analysis. And so there's a question in there, what's going to be the job creation impact of your project? And so that's the question where we begin to get at, I mean, assuming you've gotten past the pre-application, that you're not a private company asking for infrastructure funding, because then you get the letter that says, no, you need to look somewhere else. Or another sort of application we've had a couple of is if you're an organization looking to have an award so that you then yourself pass those funds out for certain purposes. We have turned down several of those because the Triumph board has determined that it is not their mission to set up mini funding agencies that they don't have control over. So if you see a business that needs a property tax abatement to locate somewhere, then you should work with your economic development team to bring that proposal directly to Triumph. because the Triumph directors are extraordinarily interested in funding that property tax abatement for the business that wants to locate here, but they are not interested in funding an intermediary organization that receives applications and then says, hey, Triumph, give us $1 million to do this property tax abatement. Okay? So that's something that is not getting funded. But what will happen is that you submit your pre-application, you get a letter saying it appears that this project may be eligible, and then depending on your timeline, the ball's in your court at that point. You submit an application, and the application looks onerous, but it's not, because there's a bunch of questions. If you're asking about this one of the 7 allowable pots of money, here's your questions. If you're asking about this pot out of the 7 pots, here's your questions. And so you only fill out one of those, depending on the pot of money that you're after. So it cuts a 30-page application down to something well under that. You fill those out to the best of your ability. You send it in. We call you with questions or comments, or you call us if you have a particular concern or timing issue or would like to get clarification on policies. And you know, we're getting to the point now, after having looked at a number of these proposals, where we actually have answers that we feel are fairly coherent and consistent across applicants to give you about how we handle things, things such as eligible categories of expenditures within a particular project. It's clear that the directors, they say things like, we want to be the cherry on top of the sundae. We want to be standing shoulder to shoulder with our funding partners. They want match. The more match, the better. Okay? And they're fairly generous about their definition of match. If you've worked with economic development incentive programs, typically there's this thing called the inducement argument. Demonstrate that the dollars that the state gives you are actually critically inducing this behavior. And if you fail the inducement test, yeah, we were going to do it anyway, then the state doesn't want to give you money. Well, Triumph has been fairly liberal in interpreting that inducement effect. It needs to be there, but for example, at the airport. You know, if you have been in Pensacola for a while, then you know that the Pensacola Intergalactic Airport has been working on their MRO campus for a number of years, right? They've been buying up bookstores and properties along Tippin Avenue there, and then knocking down the houses to get ready, because that's where hangars 3 and 4 are proposed to go, is right in there. And so the Triumph directors, when we talked about, you know, how the state does incentives and how does Triumph want to do it, the word that they came back to again and again was, it's got to be seamless. It can be in the past, and you can count it as match. So the Triumph funding of the Pensacola MRO references a $320 million project. Well, you know, $100 million of that has already been spent. And so on various things that need, like Hangar 1, that's part of the project, but it's already bought and paid for. And if you've been there, you know that they're spooling up to 400 employees there. And so that's part of the whole project. Triumph is willing to consider, as long as they are seamless components of your project, they're willing to consider things like that as match. Now, you obviously, that's a whole different concept than, well, do we get to count this thing that we've already done as part of our deliverables? The answer there is absolutely not. You get to count it as match. You've got a good big project, and Triumph directors can kind of look at themselves and say, you know, we're only 1 out of every $6 in that Pensacola MRO project, even though we're putting in $56 million. It's still only 1 out of every $6. We're standing shoulder to shoulder with our funding partners. But in terms of your performance metrics, and the statute requires that there be the potential, if the project applicant recipient does not meet their performance metrics, there has to be, according to statute, the possibility for clawing back some or potentially all of those dollars that were awarded. I mean, it's in the statute. And so that's a direction in which Florida has moved. You know, if you're doing something like Qualified Targeted Industry, QTI program with the state, that's a tax abatement program, so they give you credit against your corporate tax liability. You know, when Hertz moves its headquarters to Tampa, they get a credit against future years' tax liability, and they say, oh, great. And they can probably use it all because they're Hertz and they're operating in Florida and doing all these things. But Florida was never at risk with those dollars, because if they didn't actually put those employees in Florida, then they wouldn't have any corporate tax liability, and Florida wouldn't give them any money to pay back the taxes that they paid. Well, Triumph is required by statute. We're more like the closing fund, because we'll put in cash dollars rather than a credit against your taxes due. And so the cash dollars that Triumph puts in, the security that the legislature insisted on was, if the company doesn't meet its performance metrics, or in this case, the public government, but public say, no, we trust to special interests, and so they speak up because they respect the position that some of the younger directors are in, because if you're a young director and you're working for a company somewhere in the region, you may well be getting hit on by important people in your community that have a lot of clout who are saying, we need this project. And so I think it's fair to say that Gates and Bentz view it as their responsibility to take on the tough issues and make public statements. And those of you who have worked with them over time, I mean, imagine sitting in the Speaker's office or the President's office and you are getting bombarded daily with requests for, the state's got, well, gosh, when I went over there in 2013 to be policy advisor to the Senate, it was a $70 billion budget. And, the most recent budget was, $84 billion. And so state expenditures are growing at the rate that sales tax revenues grow. That's our general revenue fund, and it's the single largest source that we have. We get lots of federal Medicare dollars, we get gas tax dollars, transportation dollars from the feds, but people are bombarding the Speaker and the President all day long with funding requests. Meritorious, some maybe not so meritorious, but I can tell you it is surprising to me perhaps how jaded and cynical the former Speaker and the former President are about funding requests. Everybody needs money, and so it's interesting to hear some of the description about, yeah, we'll sign up for this, that, and the other, but where's my check? And so they're very keyed into the timing of disbursements, being keyed to deliverables, and they're also very attuned to the need for job creation. Now, I think that a contribution that staff and others can make is to help them recognize that in diversifying the economy, that doesn't mean that you never spend money on anything related to military. Instead, it means that you use those excellent and valuable military-friendly assets and take them in a slightly different direction. That's diversification, because you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You want to use that valuable asset that makes this an attractive place for the military, and you want to use it for a new mission, a parallel mission. That's the best way to diversify. And then same thing with our tourism assets. We clearly, the Triumph program has a condition. The directors have said clearly that they do not want to fund jobs that pay less than the county average. And everybody in this room is involved in sectors that pay well over the county average wage. And so that makes these jobs very, very attractive. But that comes up in a big way when we talk about, sports tourism and a new complex. Certainly Escambia has wanted one, Bay County has wanted one, other counties want one, and then there's lots of sports complexes that are not of the magnitude of a fully blown conference center, convention center, sports center. Well, the directors have taken, I think, if it were Enterprise Florida, they'd say, sorry, tourism is not a targeted industry, go somewhere else. We're not going to fund it. But Triumph is willing to look at the jobs that pay better than the average wage. And if you're in tourism, then probably 25, depending on your business, 25, maybe 30% of your jobs pay over the average wage, which means that, a bunch of them pay less than the average wage. But Triumph will certainly consider the economic impact of those jobs that pay better than the average wage. And then, if you look at the types of projects that have the most economic impacts, the best ones are projects which bring a lot of bang for the buck. So if you're trying to carry on the back of that project a lot of bricks and mortar and glass and steel, traditionally, most people have looked at real estate as a relatively perhaps stable but lower return investment. And so the Triumph directors are really keyed to things where they can get a lot of jobs for the least amount of money. So I think the low-hanging fruit from the perspective of Triumph are those projects which come in to create a lot of jobs and don't have a whole bunch of infrastructure associated with them. The funding amounts, if you were to do the division, the $56 million at the airport, you divide that by the 1,325 jobs that the city is, we haven't even entered a term sheet or a contract yet, so perhaps it's not appropriate to say that, but the public meeting referenced 1,325 jobs, 56 million. So if you pull out your pocket calculator, that's $42,000 per job in a target sector, right? Port of Panama City, we negotiated hard. That was the first contract we awarded, and that's a $10 million contract. And their initial proposal was very expensive because port infrastructure, if you think airports are expensive, protecting it all from salt water and corrosion is much more expensive. And so the cost per job there was $27,000 per job. And so, that's the kind of shorthand metric that the directors are comfortable with. What is the cost per direct FTE? And then they call on their economics team to say, and does it have a big multiplier on top of that? Well, yeah, if you're paying high wages, then your employees are going to be doing a lot of spending in the local economy. And if you have a highly evolved local supply chain, because you can buy a lot of your stuff and a lot of it's made up of labor rather than simply components that you buy from China or somewhere else, then if you're paying a lot for labor and you're paying a lot to labor, then you're going to have a big multiplier. And so that means that, a fewer number of jobs could carry the day and get the impact that the board is going to be looking for. So those are some of the things that the Triumph board is looking for. So yeah, Lloyd.
Two questions.
Sure.
The first one is the Triumph board interested in funding any accelerator programs here in Northwest Florida?
Good question. Is the Triumph board interested in funding any accelerator programs in Northwest Florida? And speaking openly and honestly, which I can do because I don't have a vote on the Triumph board, I can say that what they're really interested in is harvesting the low-hanging fruit of projects that come in, such as the MRO project, or such as projects that really want to come here, kind of old-timey traditional economic development projects. But, I predict, and I think you all who've spent time looking at this would agree, that one of the biggest problems that Triumph is going to have is how are we going to usefully spend that money? And so I think as the board looks around, they're going to be looking at accelerator projects. They haven't aggressively pursued any to date. They'd like a Ted Williams batting average or better. They'd like to hit 800 on their projects that they fund, but they recognize that some won't go there. And that's the risk of entrepreneurship and accelerator programs, is that the whole venture capital model is a bunch are going to fail, but then a couple are going to be really successful. And so I predict that we will get there. I don't know how immediately we will get there, but I think that we will. And I'd say the same thing for structures. Are we going to build buildings? I think every college and university that has a campus in Northwest Florida has an infrastructure request in, and buildings are expensive. I'm not aware that any of them are being funded at this time, but if you get to year 2 or 3 and your economic development team, the primary contacts who, of course, Shannon Ogletree in Santa Rosa, Scott Luth here, Nathan Sparks in Okaloosa, et cetera, as you go on, if they're not bringing you a bunch of projects that are kicking the tires and looking for the opportunity to, steal somebody else's slice of pizza out of their state and bring it to Northwest Florida, then we're going to need to look at accelerators, entrepreneurship programs, perhaps structures, other sorts of things that are not traditionally economic development recruitment projects.
Yes. So that's kind of what my second question is all about, is this idea of renovation-led economic development. It seems like the state of Florida, and generally, is not interested in that, but every other state is embracing it.
Right. Did you hear Lloyd's question that Florida has not vigorously embraced innovation-led growth, kind of, tilling the garden and of innovation and seeing what firms can grow. And clearly, my bias is that Orlando has been very successful in this. Orlando and UWF were chartered UCF and UWF were chartered in 1963 by the Florida legislature. Today, University of Central Florida has over 60,000 students, undergraduate. But it's not because of the programs that they've offered historically or that they're different. UWF is 12,000 and pushing to be bigger, but with an emphasis on quality. It's because tourism led the migration of people to Central Florida, and all those kids and adults needed a place to be schooled. And so really, there's two ways to grow your university and the kind of academic underpinnings. We're lucky to have a first-rate academic organization here that does innovative research that's not teaching classes in the IHMC. And so how do you, and you've got the same sort of thing at UCF, where they've spun off their Center for Research in, electro-optics and lasers, or the Creole Center. And those things happen when you've got, under the Florida funding program of here's your X dollars per student, you've got to have more students. You've got to have 2,000 people in your Principles of Macroeconomics section. And so when you do that, then you've got money to hire research professors that have got one course per year teaching load. Those are the ones who are going to be the innovators. You cannot expect to squeeze meaningful innovation out of people who are teaching, 3 courses a semester. First, because if you've got sufficiently high research output in terms of quality and quantity so that you can bring home those National Science Foundation grants or those DARPA grants or those DoD grants, that means that you are already at an institution. You have self-selected, you looked at 2 places to go and you said, do I want to go to this one where I'm teaching a 3-3 load, or do I want to go to this one where I'm going to teach 1 a year and plus they're going to give me $500,000 to fund my lab expenditures, which I need to get going? Well, and so there's a self-selection going on there, and so you've got to get the commitment to do that sort of research, because it is not cheap to try and get your professors down to 1/6 of their usual load, but that's how you can look at professors you're recruiting and say, you ought to come here because you're going to have what you need in terms of colleagues, in terms of workload to get done. So, how do we get innovation-led growth going? This is a place where we've got to have population growth. We've got to press on the university to recruit students, because the easiest, if you look across the state of Florida, still less than 30% of working age adults have university degrees. And so how do you get people like that in your metro area? Well, the easiest person to retain is one who chose to come here to go to university. So, and plus, universities have this great multiplier where for every dollar in tuition, they attract $1 or $2 from Tallahassee, and then spend all that money on staff and highly productive people in the local economy. So the university's got to grow. The support for the university and for other research institutions has to grow so that you can have that critical mass of people who can do the same thing that was done in Central Florida, where now they've got over 3 million square feet under roof adjacent to UCF in their innovation Commerce Park, and that's where companies go. And if you've got as many students as UCF does, and that's all due to population demographics. And there are 2 schools in Florida, 2 state schools, that have been able to successfully grow their student populations without being in high population density metros, and they are FSU and UF. Right? They're the only 2 universities in the Piney Woods that attract people from far off to come to a place where there's no people and study and grow the student body. Everybody else relies on population growth. And so we've got to encourage population growth. We've also got to attract students to things like, the honors program or the interaction with faculty. And that's how we're going to grow innovation, as well as supporting innovative activities and entrepreneurship sorts of stuff. Yeah.
We're a small business innovation research company, so our tag isn't necessarily the same as who's focusing on focusing on the universities themselves, I've basically recruited people from New York to Texas.
Mhm.
I get them here for research projects that we're doing, and because we've had some success doing research projects from DARPA to the Navy to the Air Force, we're able to attract people here, but that also attracts other states. And I think
Sure.
kind of goes along the lines of what Lloyd was talking about. Both actually worked in the Air Force Research Lab together. So
Right.
we've seen where you can attract people. The states are actually going after companies that win SIBRs because they know you've brought innovative
Right.
people into your company. They're willing to pay you matching funds of 100%. If I win a SIBR that's going to bring $1 million to our company, there are a lot of states now who are trying to say, look, we will match you at some level to bring your innovative people and ideas to our state. And I brought that up before, but Florida, I have not seen it. Nobody in Florida has contacted us or any other companies I know of about that. And I'm sorry, but there are companies that have some of that innovative thinking
Sure.
are being recruited right now, and I want to have things that I can do to make sure I can still recruit people here. And I just join in with Lloyd on this, that some thought needs to be put into
Well,
the
and
process where some of the small innovative companies can join with organizations in Florida to try to tackle that problem.
I agree. And so I knew as soon as you said small business innovative research, you put the acronym together and you were going to talk about SIBRs and the role of the federal government in incentivizing research. You know, how do you do that at the local level? Well, the Board of Governors of the Florida State University System, the SUS, has actually funded a program for recruiting excellent faculty. And UWF has had, what, $3 million over the past couple of years to do that. UF has had a much bigger amount, obviously. And so these dollars are intended to be used to attract exactly those teams. And it can work in the other direction. I mean, if you've anybody been in Pittsburgh in the last 12 months and seen all the self-driving cars on the streets? Is that Uber in Pittsburgh, or is it Google in Pittsburgh? It's Uber in Pittsburgh. And so, you know, how can your community be good enough to attract a company that really ought to be looking for its labor in Silicon Valley? Well, you have to have an excellent computer science department and one that's focused on robotics. And that's what Carnegie Mellon has in Pittsburgh. And so, you know, 40 years ago, Carnegie Mellon was a little technical school in a steelmaking town without much technology. And so they, under visionary leadership, I'm happy to say there's an economist, Sayert, who became president of Carnegie Mellon, and he set the university on a path to excellence, which is not cheap. And in fact, it's gotten much more competitive. You know, since 2011, federal funding to the sciences in inflation-adjusted terms has actually been declining. It had been growing for decades. And a lot of universities grew their quality on the back of that funding. And so how did Pittsburgh become an innovation hub? Eds and meds, you look at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Complex, you look at Carnegie Mellon, and explosive growth in turning Pittsburgh into a tech hub that can recruit Uber because their scientists like to be able to buy a Victorian house for, you know, $120,000. Try doing that in Silicon Valley. So it brings quality of life, except for the winter, and so that's a way to do it, is to make sure that your community is attractive, and you've got to spend the money to get the people here. You know, we've got an environment that people pay to vacation in, and why can't we turn it into an environment that people are happy to live in? So yeah, we've got to do that. Ed?
I've got a question about your comments tying the disbursement from Triumph to the achievement of the metrics.
Correct.
The question relates to some of these activities, perhaps some of the more productive activities where you get a good return on investment, take some time. And if indeed you marry your disbursements to achievement of those specific metrics, is that kind of short-term perspective, where you may, in a longer term, get a better return?
Right, so Ed's question is about the timing of disbursements and the timing it takes to ramp up to get your performance metrics. And so the way we've been handling that is writing into the contracts, into the performance contracts. For the education projects, we've been saying here are the number of certificates awarded that you guarantee in these particular school years, or equivalently degrees in these particular areas, to residents of Northwest Florida, right? We're not interested in educating, all of Southeast Asia in a fine online program. Instead, we're interested in bettering the lives of Northwest Florida residents through access to education programs. And so we say, in the 2021 school year, you're looking at this many certificates, in the 2021-2022 school year, this many, et cetera. And then for infrastructure projects, we've been saying that start commencing 3 years after the completion of the infrastructure project, you commit to have this many jobs. So yes, we're going to be in the monitoring business long after you and I have retired.
But if you're saying then the metric, the initial metric is the certificate, but the jobs and the improvement in income takes a little longer to be realized.
Correct. For education programs, we've really been keying in on the completion rates of the students in particular programs, and then specifying that when data become available from the Department of Economic Opportunity, that you will demonstrate that the students have achieved at least the average wage. And so those are the sorts of things that we're doing. And yes, the first measurable metrics that we can then turn around and say, congratulations on having met year 1 out of your 3 years, we won't be there for another 3 years.
A follow-on question too. You also mentioned that disbursements are tied to the contribution from the organization.
Sure.
So some of that contribution would be, as you mentioned, monies that may be already spent, monies that will be in kind. How do you manage that process?
Well, the directors have a tremendous amount of autonomy and discretion in how they handle projects. And what they have said is that as long as there is a seamless process being described where, like the MRO campus has been in the strategic plan of the Pensacola Airport since the year 2000. And so that campus is clearly something they've been working towards. And everybody in this community has been eagerly awaiting the arrival of the oil spill dollars. And when are we going to get those things spent? Our damages will not be fully remediated until those monies get spent, because each of these dollars that Triumph is spending represents lost economic activity in 2010 and 11 during the period of damages. So it takes a while to do that. So as long as the process being described is seamless, we certainly accept at face value the argument that, we always knew we were going to apply for oil spill funding, and therefore, rather than doing what, if you were going for a state incentive project, you'd say, don't spend $1, because as soon as we do, they'll know we're committed and they won't give us any money. We're trying to get past that hurdle by saying, as long as it's a seamlessly integrated process, we're willing to consider that as part of your match. It can't be part of your performance metrics, because those are still to come as you complete the project, but it can be part of your match. Other questions? Well, feel free to contact Triumph Gulf Coast anytime. We've got a pretty well-developed website, myfloridatriumph.com. So if you just go to myfloridatriumph.com, you can get in touch with any of us. And again, it's a collaborative process. We're happy to work with you on your project, give you feedback, give you reactions. So thank you. Yeah, Bob. Oh yeah, the application forms are there. All of the submitted proposals are there. So you can look and see what other people have done, how they've handled the questions. And we don't say specifically that they've been rejected. So they don't progress from the pre-application to the application phase. So, well, thanks very much for your time this evening. Appreciate it.